Good afternoon. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on Reason to Resist on October 18th, 2024. Today, I am very pleased to be joined by Dan Kovalik. Dan is a human rights lawyer and author. He's based in Pittsburgh, and that's where he joins us today. And our discussion today is going to be focused on Dan's recent trip to Moscow and the Donbass, which is an area that the West says is part of Ukraine, but is now occupied and annexed by Russia. Thank you very much for joining me, Dan.
Thank you, Dimitri. It's always a pleasure.
So just so our audience knows, because I think it's kind of like an interesting piece of information, is that the first time you and I met was in a pub in Moscow.
A very lovely pub in Moscow, yes.
Was indeed. And that was in, I believe, May or March of last year.
Yes, May. Mm-hmm.
I had gone to Russia and then on to Crimea, which of course the Russians say is Russia, for the first time in my life on that trip, because I wanted to understand the country better. And I was very concerned about the nonsense that we were hearing from our governments about its support for Ukraine and escalation of this war. I think you also, wasn't that more or less the nature of the trip for you, that you went there to acquire information, try to establish a dialogue?
Yes, I was with Rick Sterling. We were traveling together, and we were on our way to Crimea when we met. So that was a nice coincidence.
It was. So with that as background, I wanted our audience to know that you and I had a common concern and tried to address it in the same way. And we're both lawyers, of course. I want to talk to you about this recent trip to the Donbass and, any parts of Russia that you visited on this trip. Could you just give us sort of the basic overview of what you did? Where were you? How long? And what did you see?
Yeah, I flew into Moscow through Uzbekistan and spent a couple of days in Moscow and then went straight to the Donbass, which is about a 15-hour bus ride. And we entered through Luhansk. Though we didn't stay in Luhansk, we went straight to Donetsk, which is where we stayed. Spent most of the time in Donetsk, also went to Mariupol, which I had visited in November of 2022. So I have something to compare. We also visited a regiment of Ukrainian soldiers who went over to the Russian side. We visited a Chechen unit as well in Luhansk. That was the main part of our journey, which took about a week.
And so just for people who don't know this area as well as we do, just so they understand, Luhansk is an oblast, which I think is essentially the equivalent of a state or a province in the eastern part of what was Ukraine under the 1991 borders of the country. And it's more, I think, sort of not north, but not south, but east. And then Donetsk is in, it's actually, I think the whole oblast is called Donetsk, is it not, Dan?
Yes, it's the Donetsk People's Republic. It's still called that. You're right. So the whole oblast is called that. But usually if you say Donetsk in Russia, they think of that as just the city, Donetsk city. And that's, you're right, yeah.
That's a pretty big city, I understand. I don't know what the current population is, but at some point it was around 1 million, was it not? What's the current population?
I'm not sure, but they lost some people due to the war. I don't know why, I think it's like 600,000 or something like that, which is bigger than Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, where I live, which was a steel city, just like Donetsk, we used to be sister cities, actually, Pittsburgh and Donetsk. We have a very similar background with Steel City, and both of our steel cities were created by Brits, interestingly enough.
Wow.
So yeah, Donetsk city has been historically an industrial city. It was an industrial city of Russia before the Russian Revolution. It was the heart of the Russian Revolution, many people think, because it was the most industrialized part of Russia and therefore is very important in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. It then became the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union.
Right.
And that's what people have to understand when they think about this part of Ukraine. These are very Russian-oriented people with a long history with Russia, which, is a context for what is happening now.
Right. When I was in Moscow last year, I went to a museum where they had an exhibition about the Donbass, and I saw posters dating from the early days of the Bolshevik Revolution, which showed they had maps, and they showed that this area was considered to be a heartland of Russia at the time. It's just an interesting historical artifact. But in any case, I'd like to start, Dan, and let's be clear for the benefit of our audience that neither you nor I is a military expert.
No.
But we're both, as I said at the outset, we're both lawyers. And we have, however, I think it's fair to say, spent a lot of time listening to people who are military experts, particularly those who can fairly be characterized as independent. They're not working for a government. They aren't, they're senior military officers. They aren't working or being funded indirectly by a military contractor.
Right.
They're not working for some think tank that is funded by military contractors. So they're truly independent. And you and I have been saying for a very long time now, very soon after the military intervention, I'm going to call it that, in February of 2022 by the Russian Federation, that this was a battle that was destined to be lost by Ukraine, and that the sensible and humane thing to do was to bring it to an end before Ukraine was destroyed, many more people were killed, and Ukraine lost a lot more territory. I think it's fair to say, at least from my perspective, Dan, that the prediction has been entirely realized. What's your view of this, having been there, having seen something of the battlefield, spoken to the soldiers on the front line?
Yes, well, I agree. I think we were right in that assessment. By the way, this is my 5th time to the Donbass in 2 years. So I do feel like I have a very good sense of what's happening. First of all, I think the proof is in the pudding. There was a chance at a peace deal back in March of 2022. That's like a month after the war started, which appeared that both Russia and Ukraine could have agreed to. And the US and UK intervened to stop that. That's obviously significant. But what also significant is the details. Apparently, that would have allowed Ukraine to keep all of the territory that they had lost during
lost since February 2022. Just to be clear, this didn't include.
It would not have included Crimea, no, but it would have included the Donbass.
Right.
But that is now off the table. That is not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because Russia's made great gains since then. And also, frankly, has put a lot of money into reconstructing the areas in which it is now annexed.
And Russian soldiers have been killed and wounded in this process.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, what it shows is that Russia feels it has the upper hand in this war, that it now doesn't have to give up that land. And I don't think, by the way, the people in those areas want to go back to Ukraine. I think that needs to be said. There was a referendum. So there's been 2 referendums in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk in particular. So Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014 had referenda in which they voted to become sovereign countries. And then in September of 2022, those 2 oblasts plus 2 others had referenda in which they voted to go to Russia.
And the 2 others, again, for our audience, were Kherson Oblast and Zaporozhye, which are to the west or southwest of Luhansk and Donetsk. But sorry, please go ahead.
That is correct.
Right.
And I think, in truth, I've never been to Zaporozhye. I have been to Kherson, and I've been to Luhansk, and I've been to Donetsk. And I think that those referenda, I know, a lot of people criticize those referenda, but I think that they reflected the will of those people. I don't think they want to go back to Ukraine, and they don't want to go back to Ukraine because they were mistreated by the government in Kiev. These are largely Russian areas, Russian ethnic, Russian-speaking areas. And when the government in Kiev came to power in 2014, this right-wing government, through an unconstitutional coup. In fact, one of the presidents of that regime, Poroshenko, admitted that it was unconstitutional, backed by the United States. They went after their Russian-speaking population. It is a racist right-wing regime that's in Kiev that is hostile towards its own Russian population. The people in those areas felt that. They feel it now, and they feel safer being part of Russia. That is the truth.
If I might just interject, there is also, and maybe you were going to say something about this, but the president who was overthrown, the elected president, Yanukovych, as I understand it, Dan, in the election where he came to power, his support came to a highly disproportionate degree from the areas that have now been annexed by Russia. And a lot of people down there, I imagine, who live in these areas felt that their vote was effectively stolen from them when Yanukovych was violently removed from power and replaced by a Ukrainian ultranationalist. Is that fair?
It's true. And Yanukovych ran on, and I think he was true to his, the platform he ran on, was to have a peaceful coexistence with Russia, while also having a good relationship with Europe. His goal was to try to hold Ukraine, the East and West, together, and to lower the tensions between, people who viewed themselves as Ukrainians versus people who viewed themselves as essentially Russian. And I think he did a good job of that, despite a lot of pressure being exerted on him by the West not to be friendly with Russia. And ultimately, it was his vacillation on whether to sign an agreement with Europe, a big economic agreement, or with Russia, that led to his downfall, that led to the coup that the U.S. backed. They wanted someone that was not going to even consider working with the Russians, and that's what led us to here. And you're correct. If you look at a map, an electoral map from that time, it shows that he got a disproportionate support from the East. But what also should be said is that Zelensky himself ran on a peace platform, that he himself ran on a platform to end the war of Kiev against the Donbass, in which 14,000 people died before February of 2022. That has to be pointed out. Mm. And also to have a peaceful coexistence with Russia. He got about a 78% of the vote from Ukrainians on that platform. And unlike Yanukovych, he betrayed that promise. And instead, he accelerated antagonism with the Donbass.
Right.
And the weekend before the Russians intervened in the Donbass in 2022, there was a major increase in Ukrainian aggression against the Donbass. And that's according to the Organization for European Security and Cooperation. I believe that's what it's called, which has many Western members, including the United States. Right. And was at that time being led by a German. And they said there were 2,000 ceasefire violations the weekend before Russia intervened. And that's what led Russia to intervene, because Zelensky was mounting a full-scale invasion against the Donbass.
After having his forces heavily armed and trained by NATO, and particularly the United States.
And the CIA, yes, correct.
So, I said at the outset of this discussion we're having that our prediction has come true. I want to help people understand why you and I both have that view. From where I sit, I've been following reports from the battlefield, both Ukrainian and Russian. And again, I try to focus on independent military experts, people like Scott Ritter, Douglas McGregor, Matthew Ho, Larry Johnson, Jacques Beau. These are all Western military.
Lawrence Wilkerson, the former lieutenant colonel.
Right, yeah. And former chief of staff of Colin Powell. And there are others. And so I listen to them. I look at daily reports from the very beginning. Dan, you suspect you've been doing something like that too.
Yes.
What I'm seeing is the Ukrainian forces are collapsing, not just in the Donbass. I'm seeing this in the Kupiansk area. They're getting gradually annihilated in Kursk. That vaunted incursion into Russian territory is turning out to be a debacle of epic proportions based on what I'm seeing. But the place where things seem to be the worst is the place that you visited, the Donbass. That seems to be where the collapse is most rapid and is accelerating to the most degree. So what did you see in that regard when you were in the Donbass in terms of the battlefield?
Yes, the battlefield keeps moving west. The shelling against those areas by Ukraine is decreasing, and that's because Russia has taken over areas from where that shelling was happening. So those areas, which when I first went to Donetsk in 2022, November 2022, the first thing that really I was, struck with is the constant sound of shelling. Constant. Every minute, every hour, 24 hours a day, you could hear the sound of shelling. You don't hear that anymore. And Donetsk rarely gets shelled anymore. Sometimes it does, sporadically, but not on the same level it had been. Those areas are becoming secure. Mariupol, which was a main battleground, in which there was house-to-house fighting, in which the city was largely destroyed, has now been largely rebuilt. Russia's put in about $5 billion. It's incredible the amount of building that's happened there. And the only way that's happened, and the only reason the Russians would do that, is because it's completely secure now.
Right.
It's not being shelled. And by the way, there's no partisan activity to speak of in these areas. There are not Ukrainian guerrillas operating in these areas. And why is that? Because Russia has popular support in these areas. That's the other thing. Aside from Russia's military superiority over Ukraine, in the areas it controls, it has popular support. And again, the proof is in the pudding that these areas are so, for the most part, becoming peaceful. Mm-hmm. Because there are not people fighting on the streets, because they support the Russians. In fact, there's very little troop activity in these cities. You don't see Russian troops for the most part. There's some checkpoints between the cities, but you don't see Russians on soldiers on street corners.
Right.
We're told in the West these are occupied areas. There's no indication of that, Dimitri.
And Dan, I was in the West Bank, the occupied West Bank in Palestine in March. It was my 5th time there over a period of 20, 30 years. Of course, there are Israeli soldiers everywhere in the occupied West Bank. You can hardly move. They're in the villages. They're in the refugee camps, constantly coming in, making incursions. They even go into the Ramallah area where this so-called Palestinian Authority is based. So for me, having seen what an occupied area looks like in Palestine, it's quite striking to hear you say this, that you only see like checkpoints in between cities and within these large cities. Mariupol is, I think, hundreds of thousands of people. We talked about the size of Donetsk. You can hardly see Russian soldiers there. That's a powerful piece of evidence about the feelings amongst the population towards the Russian presence, I would say.
Yes, and the other evidence, for those who believe in capitalism and supply and demand and all that, housing prices have gone up in Donetsk after they became part of Russia. Why? Because people value the property more. It's more valuable because they have more confidence in the Russian Federation than they do in Ukraine. So there's many different measures that show the popular support that people have for Russia.
So Dan, you mentioned you interacted with the Chechen unit and even with a Ukrainian a unit that now fights on the Russian side, but is comprised of Ukrainians. Could you tell us about the latter first? What was that
Yeah.
all about? And secondly, in both cases with the Chechens and the Ukrainians, what was their morale like? What were they telling you about the war?
Yeah, well, the Chechens were interesting. We met with them in Luhansk. They made us some food. Both the units had food for us. Both the units allowed us to watch them training and even allowed us, some of us, all of us who wanted to. I did not partake in this, Dimitri. Even some were allowed to join in the training. I decided that would compromise my journalistic bona fides, so I did not. But morale seemed very high. A lot of these were volunteers who we talked to, and they said they were there to defend Russia. And this is a profound thing, because remember that Chechnya and was a part of the Russian Federation that tried to break away from the Russian Federation, again with support from the West. There was a major war between, a civil war between Chechnya and, the main military of Russia that was brutal, that leveled entire cities like Grozny in Chechnya. And that war was resolved by Putin after he became president. And it was really, the worst of the war was under Yeltsin. And again, that and this war as well. All this is, by the way, this is all resolving the collapse of the Soviet Union, okay, which was an undemocratic event by three leaders: the leader of the Russian Republic, Ukrainian Republic, Belarus Republic, who, against the will of the Soviet people, who voted 78% to keep the Soviet Union together in early 1991. These three leaders, on their own, in the woods, decided to end the Soviet Union. And we're still dealing with the repercussions of that. And one was Chechnya trying to break away from Russia. They now are firmly within Russia and feel connected to Russia. And so now that you have these Chechens volunteering to fight for Russia and Ukraine is a pretty profound thing. And again, their morale is very high. And we also met with this Ukrainian regiment, or a regiment of former Ukrainian soldiers who are now volunteering for Russia. They're volunteering. All of them are volunteers.
I just thought, when you say Ukrainian, are they Russian speakers or are they Ukrainian speakers? Did you get a sense of how they would identify sort of culturally and religiously, in normal circumstances?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot are from Kiev. I mean, and some are from Odessa. I mean, they're from the heartland of Ukraine. Right. And certainly would have viewed themselves as Ukrainians before 2022, okay? And a lot of these folks we talked to were forcibly conscripted. They were tricked into conscription. One guy was studying for a PhD, I think in engineering in Kiev. And he had to get a medical procedure in a hospital, and they basically took him right out of there and sent him to the front lines. And that happened to some other people as well.
Wow.
And, of course, which they resented. And also most of these people had been captured by the Russians and were treated well by the Russians. And they decided that Russia was the side they wanted to fight on, that the Russians did not have this patricidal goal that the government in Kiev had. One guy talked about that he wanted to fight the neo-Nazis, in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Others didn't put it in those terms, again, but it was about wanting to fight for Russia to end this war in a way that would not pit uh, Ukrainians against Russians, or however you want to characterize it, And that was very interesting to me. And they felt very poorly treated by Ukraine. And the result was they went to the Russian side. But again, I think they would be considered, Ukrainian people.
Right. So, I'm sure you're aware of this, Dan. There have been multiple reports in the Western press. They've gone from saying total victory, total victory, total victory for Ukraine. We won't stop until total victory. And they've always defined total victory as the recovery of all land. I say they, I'm talking about the Zelensky regime and NATO, all NATO governments in unison have been saying up until very recently, all land must be recovered from the 1991 borders of Ukraine, including even Crimea, even though Western military experts have been saying for years that it's highly doubtful that that is militarily possible. But nonetheless, as you are, I'm sure, aware, there has been a change, a very profound change in what we're reading in the press and the statements that are coming out of some Western government officials. And there's, nuances and variations in what we're hearing, but sort of the thrust of it is, as far as I can tell, is now they're saying that they will stop the fighting. The Russian forces can stay where they currently are. The West will not, nor will Ukraine's so-called government in Kiev, which, by the way, everybody should know, the term of Zelensky has expired. So even if he was democratically elected, his mandate was over months ago. But nonetheless, they can keep it, but we're not going to recognize Russian sovereignty over these areas. And what remains of Ukraine will go into NATO. Okay. So I would imagine that, the people that you encountered, civilians and soldiers, they probably pay careful attention to what Westerners are saying, what Western governments and the Ukrainian government is saying about this. Did you get any sense from either the soldiers or the civilians you met that they could, I think it's pretty clear the Russian government views that as a complete non-starter. Just the part about NATO alone is a deal breaker. I don't think they're going to put up with any part of, Ukraine being in NATO. But what I'm interested in here is the soldiers and the civilians you spoke to. Did you get from them the sense that maybe the Russian government should make compromises along those lines to bring an end to the killing? Or was the sentiment, we've got to finish the job? In other words, we've got to ensure Ukraine doesn't get into NATO, and we have to recover all of the territory in those 4 oblasts that have been annexed by Russia? Or was there a mixture of sentiment? What did you hear?
The NATO issue wasn't the most prominent issue. The issue for them was they don't want to go back to Ukraine. They want to be part of Russia. And that is a non-negotiable issue. They will fight to the death to keep those, again, particularly, I've been to Donetsk and Luhansk the most, so let me focus on those two. They are never going back to Ukraine. And they will fight to the death to stay part of Russia. And they will make sure that those areas are secure. That is the non-negotiable issue for them. They feel that is a life and death issue, literally life and death. And that's what they're fighting for. Again, initially they were fighting for their own sovereignty from 2014 to February 2022. But once Russia came in, they have been fighting to be part of Russia. And they're not going to give that up. There's no way those areas are going back to Ukraine. Again, the NATO issue for them is not the most prominent one. That is not, that's more of the issue that Russia has. And again, I don't think Russia will stand for that. But in terms of the people in these areas, they want to keep the land that they have.
Let me ask you something, Dan, which your own personal view. I'm curious to know what you think about this. Imagine that the NATO side came to the Russians and said, we are going to insist upon what remains of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, but all we're going to do is give them a guarantee of mutual self-defense, so that if they're attacked, we will defend them. But we will agree that unless there are, militarily aggressive actions taken against Ukraine by Russian forces, we will not station any of our forces on Ukrainian soil. Okay? Because I've thought to myself, if there's a compromise, maybe that's a way to resolve the NATO issue. Because as I understand the Russians' position, they don't want U.S. troops in particular, and especially U.S. nuclear-capable missiles, on the border with Ukraine, which is an entirely understandable concern, especially when you consider that the only country in the history of nuclear weapons to use them is the United States. But do you think, based on your interactions with people, especially people who might be, in the governmental bodies, both in these oblasts and in Moscow, that that's something that they would even seriously consider? Or do you think any form of NATO membership, even limited, is completely off the table?
I think, first of all, I don't have a lot of interaction with government folks, particularly in Moscow. We did interview the gentleman who was the president of the Donetsk People's Republic. He now essentially is a governor of the Oblast. And again, he didn't talk a lot about NATO. But judging from I'm just going to base my opinion on what I'm listening to from people like Vladimir Putin and Lavrov. I think that they will not compromise on that issue. And why? They don't trust the West anymore. They don't trust if the West says, oh, we'll limit it to this and we'll limit it to that. They don't believe that they're going to follow through with that, because they have been lied to so often. Yeah. Recall that the West had promised they would not move 1 inch east of Germany. They promised that to Gorbachev, who they seem to actually like. And all of this tension with Russia has been built up intentionally by moving NATO now all the way to the Russian frontier in places like Finland and Latvia and Estonia, right? And potentially in Ukraine, which has this huge border with Russia. At one point, maybe they would have gone for that, but they do not trust the West. And they make that clear.
Right.
And it was hard for them to reach that point. They wanted to trust the West. I think I just heard Putin say that he made a mistake in trusting the West for too long. So they're not going to compromise on that.
So let's switch gears a little bit. It is related to Ukraine, but and this is something I've touched on in several episodes I've done recently on Reason to Resist. There were these allegations that were leveled by the U.S. State Department against RT, the state broadcaster of Russia, which, despite Western efforts to silence it, is still watched in much of the global South. It's very hard to find everywhere in the West.
Yeah, it's actually the most, RT Arabic is the most popular news outlet in the Arabic world. Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. Well, and that's Arabic language RT, is that right?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
So you and I appear occasionally on RT. I think you might be on it more often than I am. I would say I get invited onto RT maybe 2 or 3 times a month. I don't have any kind of contract or anything. I just go on because they have an audience and they allow me to say what I want to say. And they ask me to talk about things that I care about. They've never actually vetted anything. I just interviewed Ray McGovern, and he too has been on RT many times. And he said, when I used to get invited on Fox and CBS, they would pre-interview me, right? So they say, if we ask you this question, what are you going to say? And then afterwards, suddenly they would tell him, well, we don't have any time for you today. But he said, I've never been pre-interviewed on RT, and that's true for me as well.
It's true for me as well.
So I'm curious to know, what do you make of these, first of all, these allegations that what they said in essence was RT is an arm or a tool of Russian intelligence, and it's got it's involved in military procurement, and it was all kind of weird and obscure. But the basic line was RT is bad, and it's just an arm of Russian intelligence. What do you make of those allegations, and why do you continue to appear on RT? And what impact has this had on you? The fact that you are appearing on RT and the US government is adopting such an aggressive attitude towards RT.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think, again, I've been on RT for years. I've been to their studio in Moscow. Many times I used to go to the studio in Washington when it was RT America, or when RT America exists. So I feel like I have a good sense of them. I'm friends with a number of their journalists, and I think they're real journalists. Let me just say that. I think they have a different view of the world than Western journalists, but I think that's a good thing. I think we need to hear that perspective. But as you say, I'm never told what to say on those shows, and I'm never even asked what I'm going to say ahead of time. I think it's fair to say that they are probably an analog to Voice of America, right? Or Radio Liberty in Europe, which the U.S. views as very legitimate news outlets and resents. I remember being a kid when the Soviet Union existed during the first Cold War, and the U.S. used to say, you see, Russia, how bad they are? They jam our stations like Voice of America. They don't want their people to hear the truth. Well, that's exactly what the U.S. is doing to RT in an analogous situation. Now, why do I appear on RT? For the reason you said, because they asked me to be on. I'd like to be on CNN. I'd like to be on MSNBC. I have a book I'm trying to sell. I'm not going to sell books on RT. I would if I got on CNN or MSNBC. They'll never have me on, Dimitri. So I go where I can speak what I want to say. And I feel a certain loyalty towards RT because they've allowed me to do that for years.
Right.
And I continue to go on because I feel that loyalty. I also resent my government telling me who I can talk to and not talk to, who my friends can be and not be. And by the way, I think I have a First Amendment right to appear on RT and say what I want to say. I don't think the U.S. government has the right to tell me I can't do that. And I continue appearing on RT at this point, largely to make it clear, I think I have the right to do that. And I'm not going to be bullied into not doing it. And again, these are my friends. They're my friends. And I stand by my friends. And that's what I think, good people do. Now, so what's happened to me? I mean, now every time I leave the country and come back, about 90% of the time I'm pulled over for secondary interrogation. About a month ago, I was interrogated for 4 hours. My phone was taken away. It was returned to me by mail a few days later. I presume it was copied. Everything on it. My computer was taken. It was returned to me before those 4 hours were up, but I also assume that was copied. And, I'm kind of waiting for the next shoe to fall. They've threatened indictments against people. They raided Scott Ritter's home. I've had at least 3 other friends have their phones taken. So there is kind of a witch hunt happening at this point. And yeah, I could respond by saying, okay, I surrender, I give up. I just won't talk to RT anymore. And I've considered taking that position. But at this moment, I'm not in the mood to capitulate. I don't feel I have the duty to do that. I think they're in the wrong, I'm in the right. And I'm small potatoes, Dimitri. I mean, if they go after someone like me, I mean, it shows how desperate they are. And by the way, one of my friends at RT, Che is his name. He's an Irish guy, a real nice guy. He works for them in Moscow, and we went out to a great Irish pub in Moscow when I was there. And he said, look,
Che Bose, I take it. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, and he said, look, RT's view is that the U.S. sanctions against RT shows they must be doing something right. And in fact, that obviously they're having an impact in the world by what they're doing. And I feel that way too. Like the more you try to tell me not to do something, I'm going to do it. That's just my nature. I've been that way since I was a child. I mean, I'm incorrigible. I'm
Me too.
incorrigible.
Yeah, and that's why you and I get along so well.
And I mean, honestly, to be totally honest in answering the question, why do you still appear on RT? I'd say out of spite, you know, which motivates about half of what I do.
Right.
But anyway, and it's fun too. So, so there you go. That's my answer.
Yeah. So just to finish off on his point, we said out of spite. There was an op-ed that appeared in there's this go-to newspaper for the political elite in Canada called the Hill Times, which is kind of like the Hill in the United States, or Politico. Okay, so all the political elite reads this thing, and 2 weeks ago there was an op-ed written by 2 Canadian senators and this guy named Marcus Kolga, who's he's Estonian Canadian, far-right Russophobe, warmonger neocon who's funded by the military contractors, and he holds himself out as a disinformation expert. This guy actually, when I came back from Crimea, this guy gave testimony in the Parliament of Canada because they treat him like a disinformation expert. He has like a BA in political science, and there's nothing to suggest he's actually a disinformation expert. And he goes to Parliament, and he basically, without naming me, it was clear he was talking about me, said that I had violated the sanctions law and I should be prosecuted. Because of what he said, it could only have been me that he was talking about. So now he comes out about 2 weeks ago with these 2 senators, and they write this op-ed in which they say, look at what the U.S. State Department is saying about RT. Our worst nightmares have been realized, although none of this has been proven in court, right? They just assume everything the State Department says is true. You need to investigate these Canadian influencers who are appearing in RT and charge them criminally. So the next day I was invited onto RT, and I promptly accepted the interview. And then I posted the interview on Twitter, and I tagged them, the 2 senators, in this character.
Good for you.
So they would be aware. And I said, I know how much you appreciate my appearances on RT, so I just wanted to make you aware of my latest interview. But I think, awesome. This is not just about being facetious, Dan. It's like, I've always felt that the best way to protect free speech is to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
The moment we start self-censoring, our free speech is lost. So
we've lost.
So you mentioned
I totally agree with you. Yeah. I totally agree with you. Right. And now and here's the other thing, and I don't want to go too much into the weeds, but we're on the verge of World War III, in case you haven't noticed. Now is not the time to be silent. Now is the time to make a stink. Russia's not our enemy. I don't want to go to war with them. I don't want a nuclear war. And I also see, going on RT, going to Russia, talking to Russians, being friends with Russians is part of my very modest efforts to say, hey, I reject this. I reject this move of the U.S. Towards war with Russia. I reject this. And my fellow Americans should reject it. And you're going to kill us all. You're completely mad. And the Russians are good people. And, it's a way to demonstrate that. Yeah. So I agree with you. There are big issues, really big issues.
The biggest.
And
couldn't be bigger.
The biggest we can think of. And meanwhile, of course, the hypocrisy. You have AIPAC, which owns every politician in America. I just saw the Labour Party of the UK is sending 100 functionaries to campaign for Kamala Harris. Oh, there is real foreign influence in America, and it ain't Russia. It ain't coming from Russia. And they don't care about that foreign influence. So, again, I just can't stand it. I can't stand the hypocrisy. I can't stand the high-handedness. Mm-hmm. So
since we're on the subject of hypocrisy, I want to close out our conversation today, which I've greatly enjoyed.
Me too.
On that very issue, hypocrisy. So behind you, you have this book called The Case for Palestine. I'm going to invite you to talk about that book in a moment. But first of all, I want to say, I have I follow you on social media. I've always admired your courage, your intellectual and moral courage, and you have been an outspoken critic, not only of this depraved proxy war in Ukraine, which is destroying the country, but also of U.S. support for Israel during a time of genocide. And I'm going to, first of all, invite you to tell us about your book, and then afterwards ask you to comment on, like if I had hair, Dan, I would be pulling it out every time I hear Western governments say that they are providing weapons to Ukraine to uphold democracy and human rights and the rules-based international order and all of that nonsense. Because I just can't see how anybody could possibly reconcile U.S. Western policy towards Palestinians with their approach to Ukrainians. So I'm going to ask you, what's your book all about, and what's your thought about this hypocrisy?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to talk about my book. It's The Case for Palestine, Why It Matters, Why You Should Care. And, in it, I discuss the history of Zionism and of the founding of Israel and how it was founded as an imperial project of the West, and how from the very beginning it was built upon terror and murder and rape and displacement of the Palestinian people, which continues to this day. And I think that what the West has subjected the Palestinian people to, especially since October 7th, but for many decades, shows they don't care about human rights. They don't care about humanitarian law. They don't care about international law at all. In fact, the West, particularly the United States, has done everything it can to destroy international law in order to allow Israel to engage in genocide, which is the highest crime, to violate international humanitarian law, which requires states to protect civilians even during war. And of course, Israel not only is not protecting the people of Palestine in this conflict, they are focusing all their firepower on civilians, mostly women and children. And they are intentionally starving out the 2 million plus people in Gaza, another huge violation of international humanitarian law. And the U.S. has done everything it can to cover for Israel diplomatically at the United Nations, to prevent it from being prosecuted by the International Criminal Court, to prevent the International Court of Justice from imposing its will upon Israel to halt this genocide. This shows the hypocrisy of the West, again, and in particularly the United States. And if you look at how these wars are prosecuted, if you look how Russia has prosecuted the war in Ukraine, the inconvenient fact is that Russia has done everything it can to prevent civilian casualties. And the reason the war has gone on as long as it has, look, Russia could have ended this war very quickly by doing what NATO does. And that is just obliterating Ukraine. They didn't want to do that. They don't want to do that. And if you look at the reconstruction they've done in these areas, again, like Mariupol, which was largely destroyed by the war, that type of reconstruction will never happen in Gaza or Lebanon unless, of course, it's done for the benefit of the aggressor, Israel. Instead, Israel's intentionally killing civilians, intentionally destroying infrastructure. They've destroyed churches and mosques and hospitals and schools and the whole water system of Gaza. Russia has taken great pains not to do those sorts of things. So again, the double standard applied here is just so blatant. I think that people in the West are starting to see that, but I don't think it's sunk into the point that it should, but it is glaring. And I think most of the global South, if not all of it, sees what's happening. And they see that what's happening in Gaza shows that the West is a lie. It is not civilized. It does not represent civilization. It represents its opposite. And I think I agree with them on that point.
I just want to end with your wonderful observations by adding this fact. There was a report issued by the United Nations a few months ago in which they estimated that if Gaza's destroyed housing, not damaged, destroyed housing, was rebuilt at the same pace at which it was rebuilt in prior wars, and of course, the Israelis greatly constricted the availability of the materials necessary to rebuild the damaged housing, it would take 80 years, Dan, just for the destroyed housing. Then they would have to start working on the damaged housing. And you're telling us that Russia has largely rebuilt a sizable city, Mariupol, in less than 2 years.
Yes.
Right.
It's incredible. No, it says everything. Right. And that's why, I guess we'll end by, Dimitri, that's why we go to these places, to try to just show this is the reality of the world. And what we're being told is largely the opposite of what is happening.
Right. Well, Dan, it's always a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. And I hope we can continue our conversation in the future, whether it be about the Ukraine war, what's happening in West Asia, or anything else of importance. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Dimitri. My pleasure.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you on Reason to Resist on October 18th, 2024.